Hi, our story today is called The Tale of the Flopsy Bunnies, and it's based on the original tale by Beatrice Potter. She wrote a story about Peter Rabbit, and in those stories were some of Peter's siblings, Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. And so this is based on one of the tales of Beatrice Potter. Here's the picture before we start the story. It is said that eating too much lettuce makes one drowsy. It certainly had a very drowsy effect upon the Flopsy bunnies. When Benjamin Bunny grew up, he married his cousin Flopsy. They had a large family and they were very carefree and cheerful. Since there was not always quite enough to eat, Benjamin used to take cabbages from Flopsy's brother, Peter Rabbit, who kept a nursery garden. Sometimes Peter Rabbit had no cabbage to spare. When this happened, the Flopsy bunnies went across the field to a rubbish heap in the in the ditch outside Mr. McGregor's garden. A rubbish heap is probably one of those unknown words for you. It's another name for a pile of garbage. Mr. McGregor's rubbish heap was a mixture of jam jars, paper bags, mountains of chopped grass from the mowing machine, which always tasted oily, some rotten squashes, and an old boot or two. There the bunnies are, heading for the garden and the rubbish heap. One day, oh joy, there was lots of unattended lettuce which had flowered. The Flopsy bunnies simply stuffed themselves with lettuce. Little by little, one after another, they became very sleepy and lay down in the mown grass. Benjamin was not as overcome as his children. Before going to sleep, he was awake enough to put a paper bag over his head to keep off the flies. The little Flopsy bunny slept delightfully in the warm sun. From the lawn behind the garden came the distant clackety sound of the mower. The bluebottle flies buzzed about the wall, and a little old mouse picked over the rubbish among the jam jars. She was called Thomasina Tittlemouse, and she was a wood mouse with a long tail. She rustled across the paper bag and woke Benjamin Bunny. The mouse apologized over and over again. She said she knew Benjamin's cousin, Peter Rabbit. While she and Benjamin were talking close to the wall, they heard heavy footsteps above their heads. Suddenly, Mr. McGregor emptied out a sack of mown grass right on top of the sleeping Flopsy bunnies. Benjamin shrank down under his paper bag. The mouse hid in a jam jar. The little rabbits smiled sweetly in their sleep under the shower of grass. They did not wake up because the lettuce had made them so drowsy. They dreamed that their mother Flopsy was tucking them in a hay bed. Mr. McGregor looked down after emptying his sack. He saw some funny little brown tips sticking up through the grass. He stared at them for some time. After a while, a fly settled on top of one of them, and it moved. It was an ear. Mr. McGregor climbed down onto the rubbish heap. What do you think will happen to those little bunnies? One, two, three, four, five, six little rabbits, he said as he dropped the bunnies into his sack. The Flopsy bunnies dreamed their mother was turning them over in bed. They stirred a little in their sleep, but still they did not wake up. Mr. McGregor tied up the sack and left it on the grass. He went to put the mower away. While he was gone, Mrs. Flopsy Bunny, who had stayed at home, came across the field. She looked suspiciously at the sack and wondered where everybody was. Then the mouse came out of her jam jar, and Benjamin took the paper bag off of his head, and they told her the sad story. Benjamin and Flopsy were in despair because they could not undo the string. But Mrs. Tittlemouse was a resourceful person. She nibbled a hole in the bottom corner of the sack. The little rabbits were pulled off and pinched awake. Their parents stuffed the empty sack with three rotten squashes, an old boot brush, and two decayed turnips. Then they all hid under a bush and watched for Mr. McGregor. Mr. McGregor came back and picked up the sack and carried it off. He carried it hanging down as if it were heavy. The Flopsy bunnies followed at a safe distance. They watched him go into his house, and then they crept up to the window to listen. Mr. McGregor threw down the sack on the stone floor in a way that would have been extremely painful to the Flopsy bunnies if they had really been in the sack. They could hear him drag his chair on the floor and chuckle. One, two, three, four, five, six little rabbits. Eh? What is that? What have they been eating now? Asked Mrs. McGregor. One, two, three, four, five, six fat little rabbits, repeated Mr. McGregor, counting on his fingers. One, two, three. Oh, don't be silly. What do you mean, you silly old man? In the sack. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, replied Mr. McGregor. The youngest Flopsy Bunny jumped up into the windowsill. Mrs. McGregor took the sack and felt it. She said she could feel 6, but they must be old rabbits because they were so hard and all different shapes, not fit to eat. But the skins will do fine to line my old cloak, she said. Line your old cloak, shouted Mr. McGregor. I shall sell them and buy myself some tobacco. Mrs. McGregor untied the sack and put her hand inside. When she felt the vegetables, she became very, very angry. She said that Mr. McGregor had done it on purpose, and Mr. McGregor was angry too. He threw one of the rotten squashes through the kitchen window and hit the youngest Flopsy Bunny. It was rather hurt. Then Benjamin and Flopsy thought it was time to go home. So Mr. McGregor did not get his tobacco, and Mrs. McGregor did not get her rabbit skins. But that Christmas, Thomasina Tittlemouse got a present of enough rabbit wool to make herself a cloak and a hood and a handmade muff and a pair of warm mittens. And here is a picture of Mrs. Tittlemouse, all decked out in her warm rabbit fur cloak and hat and mittens. Now let's think about the characters for a minute. Who were some of the characters in our story? If you said the little bunnies, you're right. And Flopsy and Benjamin, they were characters. Who was the villain character in our story? That would have been Mr. McGregor, you're right. And where would this setting have been? Where do you think the setting would be? The setting would be in a garden. You are right. Have a good day, and we'll have another story tomorrow.